I never imagined that my own son would tell me, "You are not a priority anymore," and then walk away as if it meant nothing. The words didn't just hang in the air, they drilled into the very marrow of my bones, a cold shock that felt more final than a closing door. I sat at my kitchen table, the one my late husband, Frank, and I had picked out over 50 years ago, its oak surface scarred with the history of our family, nicks from stray forks, a faint ring from a forgotten coffee cup, a deep scratch from a childhood science project gone wrong. Each mark was a story, a memory of a life I thought I had built on a foundation of love. Now, that foundation felt like sand. The early morning sun, usually a gentle friend, cast long, accusatory shadows across the linoleum floor. My coffee, once a comforting ritual, had gone cold in my hands. I was wearing my favorite faded blue sweater, the one with the slightly frayed cuffs that always felt like a hug. It offered no comfort now. Across the table, the chair where my son, Tom, had been sitting was starkly empty. He was 42 years old, a man with a wife, 2 children, and a life of his own a few states away. A life that, he had just made painfully clear, had no significant room left for me. The conversation had started innocently enough. I'd called him the night before, my heart fluttering with the same hopeful anticipation I'd felt every year. "I was thinking of coming for Thanksgiving," I'd said, already picturing my granddaughters' faces, the smell of my daughter-in-law Sarah's pumpkin pie, the chaotic, beautiful noise of a family united. His silence on the other end of the line was the first warning. It wasn't a thoughtful silence, it was a heavy, burdened one. "Let me call you back in the morning, Mom," he'd said, his voice strained. "Sarah and I need to talk." And so he had. He'd driven the 40 minutes from his hotel, he was in town for a conference, to see me this morning. He'd accepted a cup of coffee, his eyes avoiding mine as he stirred in the cream and sugar. He'd talked about work, the girls' school activities, the new deck they were building. Small talk. The kind of talk you used to build a wall, not a bridge. I'd let him finish, my own hands wrapped tightly around my mug for warmth, though the chill was coming from inside me. "So, about Thanksgiving, Tom," I finally prodded gently. He sighed, a long, weary sound that made me feel ancient. "Look, Mom. It's just not a good time this year. The girls have their pageant, and Sarah's parents are coming for the whole week. The house is going to be a madhouse." "Oh," I said, the sound small in the quiet kitchen. "I wouldn't be any trouble. I can sleep on the sofa, or I could get a hotel. I just want to see the girls. I miss them." "I know you do, Mom, but it's more than that." He finally looked at me, and his eyes held a kind of weary impatience I'd never seen directed at me before. It was the look of a man trying to solve a logistical problem, not a son talking to his mother. "It's just a lot to manage. Sarah gets stressed. We have our own traditions now. Our own little family unit." Each word was a careful, deliberate step away from me. "I'm part of the family, Tom," I whispered, my voice trembling. That's when he delivered the final, fatal blow. He stood up, pushing his chair back with a soft scrape against the floor. He ran a hand through his hair, the same way his father used to when he was frustrated. "Mom, please don't make this difficult," he said, his tone turning sharp. He looked at his watch, a clear signal that this conversation had an expiration date. "We have our life, the girls, my job, our marriage. That's my focus. You have to understand." He paused, and then the words came out, flat and devoid of emotion. "You're not a priority anymore." He might as well have slapped me. The air left my lungs in a silent gasp. A priority. I had spent my entire adult life making him my priority. From the moment I first held him, a tiny, screaming bundle wrapped in a hospital blanket, he had been the sun around which my world revolved. I remembered sleepless nights, fevers, and scraped knees. I remembered saving for months to buy him his first bicycle, the pride in his eyes as he wobbled down the street without training wheels. I remembered typing his college papers late into the night when he was overwhelmed, packing his lunch every single day until he graduated high school, leaving little notes inside that he pretended to be embarrassed by, but I know he read. I remembered giving him and Sarah a substantial part of my savings, Frank's life insurance money, so they could afford the down payment on their house. The house I was now apparently not welcome in. All of those moments, all of that love, all of that sacrifice, had been demoted. I wasn't a person to him in that moment. I was an item on a to-do list that had been moved to the bottom. An obligation. A complication. He saw the look on my face, the utter devastation, and for a second, a flicker of something, guilt, perhaps, crossed his features. But it was fleeting. He hardened himself against it. "I have to go," he said, his voice clipped. "I have a meeting at 10. He walked to the door and paused, his hand on the knob. He didn't turn around. "I'll call you next week," he said, a hollow promise that we both knew was more for his benefit than for mine. And then he was gone. The door clicked shut, the sound echoing in the cavernous silence of my home, my heart, my life. I sat there, unmoving, staring at his empty chair. The sun climbed higher in the sky, the light growing stronger, but my world had never felt so dark. I was 76 years old, and for the first time, I felt utterly and completely alone, stranded in the wreckage of a life I had dedicated to a son who no longer saw me. The coffee in my cup was a bitter, cold reminder of the conversation, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that nothing would ever be the same. The shock was beginning to recede, replaced by a deep, aching grief that settled in my chest like a stone. He had walked away as if it meant nothing, but to me, it meant everything. The silence Tom left behind was heavier than any sound. It pressed in on me, amplifying the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound that had once been a comforting heartbeat in our home but now felt like a countdown to an empty future. I watched a dust mote dance in a sunbeam, a tiny, insignificant thing floating freely, and I envied its lack of attachment, its weightlessness. I felt anchored to my chair by the sheer gravity of my son's words. I was not a priority. The phrase looped in my mind, each repetition stripping away another layer of my identity. If I wasn't a mother, a grandmother, a central figure in my family's life, then who was I? My gaze drifted around the kitchen, a museum of my devotion. On the refrigerator, held up by a collection of cheesy souvenir magnets, were my granddaughter's school pictures. Lily, with her gap-toothed grin, and Chloe, more serious, with my eyes. I had been so proud to display them, to show visitors that my life was still full, still connected. Now, they felt like relics from another era, a life that was no longer mine to claim. I saw the worn-out spot on the floor in front of the sink where I had stood for countless hours, washing dishes, preparing meals, looking out the window for Frank's car to pull into the driveway, and later, for Tom's school bus to round the corner. This kitchen had been my command center, the heart of the family, and I had been its keeper. It seemed the position had been rendered obsolete. My mind, unbidden, began to play a highlight reel of my sacrifices, not with the warm glow of nostalgia, but with the harsh, unflattering light of Tom's rejection. I saw myself at 25, a promising young artist with a small but growing reputation for my watercolor landscapes. I had just been offered a spot in a prestigious gallery in the city. Frank was proud, but he was also a practical man. "It's a wonderful honor, Rosie," he'd said, "but Tom is only 2. It would be a long commute. Who would watch him?" And just like that, without argument, I had packed away my paints and my dreams. Motherhood was my new art form, my new gallery. I told myself it was a more important calling. For years, I believed it. Then came the memory of my own mother's final illness. She had lived 200 miles away, and her last few months were a blur of hospitals and whispered conversations with doctors. Tom was in high school then, right in the middle of his final exams. He was a good student, but he worried constantly. "I can't fail my physics exam, Mom," he'd said, his face pale with stress. "It's half my grade." Frank had to work, his job was demanding. So I made a choice. I drove back and forth, spending 3 days with my dying mother, then driving 4 hours home to cook for Tom, do his laundry, and offer him reassurances before turning around and doing it all again. I was exhausted, my heart torn in two, but I told myself that's what mothers do. You split yourself into as many pieces as necessary. I was with my father when my mother finally passed, but I had missed her last lucid day because I had driven home to make sure Tom had a home-cooked meal before his chemistry final. I had carried the guilt of that for decades, but I'd always justified it. Tom needed me. The financial sacrifices were easier to quantify but no less painful to recall. Frank hadn't left a fortune, but it was enough. Enough for me to live comfortably, to not have to worry. But then Tom and Sarah wanted their dream house. The market was competitive, and their savings weren't quite enough. I sat them down at this very table and wrote them a check for $50,000. It's not a loan, I'd said, my heart swelling with a kind of maternal largesse. It's a gift. An investment in your future, in my grandchildren's future. Sarah had cried and hugged me, calling me their guardian angel. Tom had looked me in the eye and said, with a voice thick with emotion, "Mom, I don't know how we can ever repay you." It turned out he was right. He couldn't repay me, because he didn't even value the currency in which the debt was issued, love and sacrifice. That money could have been a trip to Italy to see the great art I'd only ever studied in books. It could have been new furniture, a new car, or simply the peace of mind of a larger nest egg for my own final years. Instead, it was a down payment on a house where I wasn't even a priority for a holiday visit. The breaking point wasn't just the words. It was the casualness with which he'd delivered them. It was the way he'd checked his watch. It was the finality of the closing door. He hadn't just forgotten my sacrifices, he had erased them. They didn't exist in his version of our shared history. In his world, he had achieved his success on his own. His comfortable life, his happy family, it was all his own doing. I was just a ghost from the past, a sentimental attachment that had become inconvenient. I pushed myself up from the table, my joints creaking in protest. The emptiness in the room was a physical presence now, a cold, heavy fog. I walked through the quiet house, my hand trailing along the walls. Here was the height chart we'd kept for Tom, penciled onto the doorframe of the pantry, starting from when he was a toddler all the way up to taller than Mom. Here was the dent in the hallway wall from an errant hockey puck. Here was his bedroom, which I had kept exactly as he'd left it, a shrine to a boy who no longer existed. On his desk sat a framed photo of me and him at his college graduation. We were both beaming. I looked so proud, so full of hope for his future. He looked grateful, happy, his arms slung around my shoulders. Looking at it now, I felt a wave of nausea. Was it all a lie? Was the gratitude just a performance? I sat on the edge of his bed, the familiar chenille bedspread soft beneath my fingers. The overwhelming feeling was not anger, not yet. It was a profound, soul-crushing sense of being utterly and completely spent. I had poured everything I had, my time, my money, my dreams, my energy, my love, into a vessel that was not just full, but had now decided it was overflowing and needed to discard the source. I had given until there was nothing left of the woman I used to be, the woman I might have become. I was a hollowed-out shell, and my son, my only child, had just held me up to the light and pointed out how empty I was. The grief was a physical thing, a weight on my chest that made it hard to breathe. I lay back on his childhood bed, closed my eyes, and for the first time in a very long time, I didn't think about what my son needed. I just felt the shattering of my own heart. And in the silence of that room, I finally began to cry, not soft, gentle tears, but heaving, racking sobs for the woman I had lost along the way, myself. The tears eventually subsided, leaving behind the raw, puffy-eyed exhaustion of deep sorrow. I lay on Tom's bed for what felt like hours, watching the afternoon light fade outside the window, the world turning from gold to a bruised purple. The house grew colder. I should have gotten up to turn on the heat, but I couldn't summon the will. The chill inside me was far more pervasive than the one in the air. It was in this cold, quiet state that a new feeling began to germinate in the barren soil of my grief. It wasn't anger, not the hot, quick burning kind. It was something colder, clearer. It was resolve. My son's words, as cruel as they were, had been a kind of gift. A terrible, painful, unwanted gift, but a gift nonetheless. They were a bucket of ice water thrown on a person who didn't even realize they were asleep. For decades, my identity had been reflected back at me through the eyes of others: Frank's wife, Tom's mother, Lily and Chloe's grandmother. I had molded myself to fit their needs, their expectations, their schedules. I had become a supporting character in my own life story. Tom's declaration that I was no longer a priority forced me to ask a terrifying question: had I ever made myself my own priority? The answer was a resounding, shameful no. I pushed myself into a sitting position, my back aching. I caught my reflection in the dark glass of the window. I saw a stooped figure, her face etched with the road map of her 76 years, her hair a wispy white cloud. But for the first time, I looked past the wrinkles and the age spots. I looked into my own eyes. They were my mother's eyes, full of a strength I had forgotten I possessed. They were tired, yes. They were filled with pain. But they were not defeated. Not yet. I stood up, and this time, my movements felt different. They were deliberate. I walked out of Tom's room and closed the door behind me, not with anger, but with a sense of finality. It was no longer a shrine. It was just a room. I went into my own bedroom, a space that was neat and tidy and impersonal, decorated with the pale floral patterns Frank had preferred. I walked directly to the antique secretary desk in the corner, a piece of furniture I rarely used except to pay bills. I opened the top drawer and pulled out a stack of official-looking documents held together by a paperclip. My last will and testament. Frank and I had drawn them up together with our lawyer, Mr. Abernathy, years ago. The terms were simple: upon the death of one, everything went to the survivor. Upon the death of the survivor, everything was to be split equally. Except we only had one child. So everything, the house, the savings, the investments, Frank's modest pension, was to go to Tom. It had seemed like the most natural, logical thing in the world at the time. It was the culmination of a life's work, to build something and pass it on. I sat down in the creaking chair, the documents spread out before me on the desk. I read through the legal jargon, the formal language that outlined the transfer of my entire existence to the son who had just discarded me. I give, devise, and bequeath all the rest, residue, and remainder of my estate, both real and personal, to my beloved son, Thomas J. Miller. Beloved son. The words felt like ash in my mouth. This document was no longer just a legal instrument. It was a symbol. It was the ultimate expression of my life's mission: to serve, to provide, to give everything away until nothing was left. It was a testament to the woman who was not a priority. And I knew, with a clarity that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that it had to change. This wasn't about punishing Tom. It wasn't about revenge. I knew in my heart that if he were truly in need, if he were destitute, I would not let him suffer. But he wasn't. He was a successful man with a six-figure salary, a beautiful home, and a thriving family. My legacy wasn't a lifeline for him, it was a bonus. A final, posthumous convenience. And my life, what was left of it, was worth more than that. My assets were not a reward for filial devotion he hadn't shown, they were the product of my labor, my sacrifices, my life with Frank. They were mine. My hand trembled as I reached for the telephone on the desk. My fingers felt stiff and clumsy as I looked up the number for Abernathy and Sons, attorneys at law. The and Sons part was new. Old Mr. Abernathy had likely retired, passing the torch to his own children. The irony was not lost on me. I dialed the number, my heart pounding against my ribs. A pleasant voice answered on the third ring. Abernathy and Sons, how may I help you? My own voice, when it came out, was raspy but firm. Hello. My name is Rose Miller. I'm a client of. Well, I was a client of Mr. Abernathy Sr. I need to make an appointment to revise my will. Of course, Mrs. Miller. Would you like to schedule with Mr. Abernathy Jr.? Yes, that would be fine, I said. We settled on a time for the following week. After I hung up the phone, I sat in the gathering darkness of my room, the will still spread out before me. Making that call felt like stepping off a cliff. I had no idea what I was going to do, what I would change the will to. The idea of not leaving everything to my only child felt unnatural, a violation of some sacred maternal code. But the act itself, the act of taking control, of declaring that my life and its material worth were mine to direct, was a seismic shift. It was the first decision I had made in years that was purely for me. It wasn't about what was best for Tom, or what Frank would have wanted, or what society expected of a grieving widow. It was about what was right for Rose. I didn't know who that was yet, but I had a feeling I was about to find out. A tiny, flickering pilot light of self-preservation had just been ignited in the cold darkness of my heart, and as I sat there, I vowed I would not let it go out. The days leading up to my appointment with Mr. Abernathy Jr. were a strange combination of anxiety and quiet contemplation. I moved through my house like an archaeologist, dusting off the artifacts of my own life, trying to piece together a history that made sense. With the decision to change my will acting as a new lens, everything looked different. I found myself mentally cataloging not just the moments of sacrifice for Tom, but the much longer, more subtle history of my own self-effacement. It was a pattern that had begun long before my son was born. My thoughts drifted back to my marriage. I had loved Frank, I truly had. He was a good man, a steady provider, a pillar of the community. But he was a man of his time. Our home was his castle, and I was its devoted caretaker. His needs, his comforts, his schedule, these were the tent poles around which our life was constructed. I remembered how he loved his roast beef cooked a certain way, how he insisted on the newspaper being ironed before he read it, a peculiar habit he'd picked up from his father. I did it without question. It never occurred to me to ask if he would iron my section of the paper. My desires were smaller, more malleable, easily folded and tucked away. I recalled a conversation we had early in our marriage. I had wanted to take a pottery class at the local community college. It was just one night a week. Frank hadn't forbidden it, he was never that overt. He'd simply sighed and said, "Well, Rosie, who would make my dinner on Tuesdays? I get home so late from the Rotary meeting." And that was that. I dropped the idea. I didn't want to be a bother. I didn't want to upset the delicate equilibrium of our household. I see now that the equilibrium was tilted entirely in his favor. My role was to absorb, to adapt, to smooth over any potential disruptions. I had mistaken this constant, yielding service for love. In many ways it was, but it was an incomplete love, one that never asked what I needed in return. This pattern of putting others first had been so deeply ingrained in me that I'd carried it into every aspect of my life. I remembered the endless bake sales for Tom's school, staying up until 2 in the morning baking dozens of cookies, not because I particularly enjoyed it, but because the other mothers were doing it, and I felt a pressure to be the perfect mother. I remembered volunteering to be the treasurer for the Parent-Teacher Association for 4 years straight because no one else wanted the job, spending hours hunched over ledgers and bank statements. I had told myself I was being a good community member, a supportive parent. But looking back, I see a woman who didn't know how to say no, who believed her time was less valuable than everyone else's. The most painful thread to unravel was the slow, quiet death of my own passions. After packing away my watercolors, I had promised myself I would return to them someday. Someday when Tom was in school. Someday when he was in college. Someday when he was married and settled. Someday when Frank retired. The somedays kept piling up, a mountain of deferred dreams. Frank passed away before he could retire, and then my focus shifted entirely to being the supportive, ever-present matriarch for Tom and his new family. My art supplies were still in the attic, tucked away in a dusty box, the pigments dry and cracked, the brushes stiff with disuse. I had not just packed away my tools, I had packed away a part of my soul. One afternoon, driven by this new archaeological curiosity, I climbed the rickety pull-down stairs to the attic. The air was thick with the smell of old wood and mothballs. I found the box easily. Kneeling on the dusty floorboards, I lifted the lid. There they were. My brushes, my tubes of paint, my pads of thick, textured paper. I ran a finger over a hardened tube of ultramarine blue. It was like touching a tombstone. A wave of profound sadness washed over me, a grief for the vibrant young woman who had held these tools with such hope and excitement. What would she think of me now? This timid, heartbroken old woman who had let her colors fade and her passions dry up. I realized that Tom's cruel words were not an isolated incident. They were the logical conclusion of a lifetime of my own choices. I had taught him, and everyone else, how to treat me. I had taught them that my needs were secondary, that my time was endlessly available, that my resources were theirs for the taking. I had shown them that Rose was not a person, but a role: wife, mother, grandmother. A function. And when that function was no longer needed, it could be set aside. I had spent my life making myself smaller and smaller to make room for others, and I had finally shrunk to the point of being invisible. Confronting this was excruciating. It was so much easier to blame Tom, to cast him as the villain in my story. And while his actions were undeniably hurtful, I was beginning to see that he was only playing the part I had written for him. The real work wasn't just about changing my will, it was about rewriting the entire script, with a new protagonist. I brought the box of art supplies down from the attic and placed it on the dining room table. I didn't open it again just yet. It was enough to have it in my living space, a silent testament to a part of me I was determined to resurrect. It was a promise. As I sat with a cup of tea, looking at that box, I felt the first real flicker of something other than pain or resolve. It was a fragile, tentative curiosity. I wondered if I could still paint. I wondered if there was anything left inside me worth putting on paper. The thought didn't fill me with the same sense of duty as baking cookies or balancing ledgers. It filled me with the quiet, unfamiliar thrill. It was the feeling of a locked door for which I had just, perhaps, found the key. The past was a landscape of sacrifice, but for the first time, I felt I might have the courage to paint a new one for my future. A few days later, feeling adrift and desperately in need of structure, I saw a flyer at the grocery store. It was for the Elmwood Senior Community Center, advertising a weekly coffee and conversation hour. The photo showed a group of smiling, white-haired people sitting around a table, laughing. It looked warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the cold silence of my own home. My first instinct was to dismiss it. That's for old people, I thought, a ridiculous notion coming from a 76-year-old woman. But it was more than that. The idea of walking into a room full of strangers was terrifying. I hadn't had to make a new friend in 50 years. But the thought of another day spent alone with my ghosts was even more terrifying. So, on a crisp autumn Tuesday, I put on my good coat, combed my hair, and drove the 10 minutes to the center. I almost turned the car around twice. When I walked through the doors, the smell of percolating coffee and something sweet, maybe cinnamon rolls, hit me. The room was buzzing with chatter and laughter, just like the picture. A woman with a bright pink cardigan and a halo of cheerful white curls saw me hesitating by the doorway. "First time?" she asked, her voice warm and crinkly. I nodded, feeling like a new kid at school. "Well, don't just stand there, honey. Grab a cup. I'm Martha." She took my arm with a gentle but firm grip and led me toward the coffee urn. "The coffee's mediocre, but the company's first-rate." I mumbled my name, Rose. Martha introduced me to a table with 3 other people, a gruff-looking man named George who was complaining about property taxes, a quiet woman named Eleanor who was knitting a complicated-looking scarf, and a man named Arthur who had kind, intelligent eyes and was working on a crossword puzzle. I sat down, clutching my styrofoam cup of coffee like a life raft. For the first 20 minutes, I said nothing, just listened. They talked about their children, their grandchildren, doctor's appointments, the rising price of eggs. It was ordinary, but it was real. It was connection. "What about you, Rose?" Arthur asked, looking up from his puzzle. "You have family in the area?" The question was a landmine. My throat tightened. I could give the easy answer, yes, a son, 2 lovely granddaughters. But the lie felt heavy, and the truth felt like a wound I didn't want to expose to strangers. Martha, who seemed to have an uncanny emotional intuition, must have seen the conflict on my face. "Now, Arthur, don't go interrogating the poor woman. Let her get her feet wet." She turned to me. "My son lives in California. Thinks a phone call on Christmas and my birthday is a gold medal in parenting." She said it with a wry smile, but I saw a flicker of the same hurt in her eyes that I felt in my heart. It was an opening. A quiet permission slip. I took a shaky breath. "My son. He lives a few states away," I began, my voice barely a whisper. "He was in town recently." I paused, and the table went quiet, sensing there was more. The words came out in a rush before I could stop them. "He told me I wasn't a priority for him anymore." As soon as I said it, I felt a hot flush of shame. I had exposed my deepest hurt, my family's failure, to these strangers. I expected pity, or awkward silence. Instead, George snorted. "Priority? My daughter calls me when her car breaks down or she needs a babysitter. That's the only time I'm a priority." Eleanor looked up from her knitting, her needle stopping for the first time. "My children are good, they are. But they're busy. They have their own lives. Sometimes I do feel like I've been placed on a shelf, like a keepsake they're fond of but don't have much use for anymore." Arthur looked at me with a deep, compassionate gaze. "That must have been incredibly painful to hear, Rose. To have it said so bluntly." It wasn't pity. It was understanding. It was a chorus of shared experience. I felt a knot in my chest, one I hadn't even known was there, begin to loosen. I wasn't the only one. My pain wasn't a unique, shameful secret. It was a common sorrow, a quiet epidemic of the elderly. For the rest of the hour, we talked. I didn't say much more, but I listened intently as they shared their own stories of navigating the complex, often disappointing, terrain of life with adult children. They spoke of loneliness, of feeling obsolete, but also of resilience, of finding new purposes. When the hour was up, Martha patted my hand. "You come back next week, you hear? You're one of us now." Walking out of the community center, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. The world seemed a little brighter, the autumn air less biting. I had found a small tribe. I had used my voice to speak my truth, and instead of crumbling, I had been met with empathy. It was a revelation. My worth wasn't something to be granted or revoked by my son. It was inherent. And here, in this humble room with mediocre coffee, a group of strangers had reflected that worth back at me, making it feel real for the first time. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in 30 years. I went into the dining room, opened the box of art supplies, and took out a clean sheet of watercolor paper. I taped it to a board, filled a glass with water, and squeezed a small dollop of cerulean blue onto a ceramic plate. My hand trembled as I dipped the brush in the water, then into the paint. I hesitated for a moment, the blank white page as intimidating as any empty room. Then, thinking of Martha's pink cardigan, of Arthur's kind eyes, of the shared understanding that had warmed me more than any coffee, I touched the brush to the paper. A wash of pale blue spread across the surface, imperfect and a little shaky, but it was a start. It was my mark. My voice, in a new color. And as I added a touch of yellow to create a soft, hopeful green, I felt a spark of the old Rose, the artist, flicker back to life. She wasn't gone. She had just been waiting. The weekly meetings at the community center became my anchor. Each Tuesday, I would walk in feeling a little less like an intruder and a little more like I belonged. Martha, with her boisterous laugh and sharp wit, became my confidant. Arthur, a retired history professor, became my intellectual sparring partner, recommending books and engaging me in discussions about politics and art. I learned that George's gruff exterior hid a surprisingly tender heart, especially when he spoke of his late wife. Eleanor, it turned out, knitted scarves and blankets for a local homeless shelter, her quiet presence a testament to a different kind of strength. These were not just old people. They were vibrant, complex individuals with rich histories and present-day concerns. They saw me not as Tom's forgotten mother, but as Rose. Just Rose. And I was beginning to like her. The appointment with Mile Oyer, Mr. Abernathy Jr., a kind but formal man who looked disconcertingly like a younger version of his father, was less emotional than I had feared. My new resolve acted as a kind of armor. I sat across the polished mahogany desk from him and explained, in a calm and steady voice, that I wanted to amend my will. "Of course, Mrs. Miller," he said, pulling up my file on his computer. "You wish to add provisions for your granddaughters, perhaps a trust?" Yes, I said. I did want to set something aside for Lily and Chloe. They were innocent in all of this. But the primary change is that I no longer wish for my son, Thomas, to be the sole beneficiary of my estate. Mr. Abernathy Jr. stopped typing. He looked at me over the top of his glasses, his expression carefully neutral, but I could see the flicker of surprise. "May I ask? Is this a final decision?" "It is," I said, my voice unwavering. "And the residue of your estate? Where would you like it to be directed?" This was the question I had been pondering for a week. What does a woman who is just rediscovering her own value do with her life's savings? My first thought had been to give it all to charity. But that felt like another form of self-effacement, giving everything away to a faceless cause. Then I thought about my new friends. I thought about Eleanor knitting her scarves, about the community center that had become my lifeline, running on a shoestring budget. I thought about the dusty box of paints and the young artist I used to be. "I want to establish a small foundation," I said, the words feeling bold and powerful on my tongue. "The Rose Miller Foundation for the Arts." I explained my vision, to provide grants to local senior citizens who wish to pursue art, music, or writing. To fund classes at the community center. To buy supplies for people who, like me, had packed their dreams away in an attic and might just need a little encouragement to retrieve them. A portion would still go to my granddaughters, placed in a trust they could access when they were 25. The rest, including the house, would fund the foundation. As I spoke, Mr. Abernathy Jr.'s professional mask slipped into one of genuine interest. He started taking notes vigorously. When I finished, he looked at me with a new respect. "That's a remarkable legacy, Mrs. Miller." Legacy. The word resonated deep within me. Before, my legacy was just a transfer of assets to my son. Now, it had a purpose. It was a continuation of my own rediscovery. It was about planting seeds for others to grow. I left the lawyer's office feeling 10 feet tall. The universe, it seems, has a strange sense of timing. The very next weekend, my phone rang. The caller ID read Tom. My heart gave a familiar, nervous flutter, but it was different this time. It wasn't the anxious leap of a mother waiting for a call, it was the steady beat of a woman preparing for a conversation she knew she had to have. I let it ring 3 times before I answered. "Hi, Mom." His voice was hesitant, tinged with an unfamiliar note of contrition. "Hello, Thomas," I replied, my tone calm and even. Using his full name felt like a small but significant boundary. "Look, Mom, I've been thinking about our last conversation. I was out of line. Completely," he sighed. "Things have been stressful. Work is a nightmare. Sarah and I have been arguing a lot. I took it out on you, and it was wrong. I'm really sorry." The old me would have melted. The old me would have rushed to soothe him, to say, "It's okay, dear, I understand, don't you worry about it." But the old me was retired. "I appreciate the apology, Thomas," I said, my voice still quiet, but firm. My lack of immediate forgiveness seemed to throw him off. "Oh. Good. So. Are we okay?" "Your words were very hurtful," I stated simply, not as an accusation, but as a fact. "They made me reevaluate many things." "Right. Yeah. I'm so sorry," he repeated, sounding a bit desperate now. "Listen, Sarah and I were talking. We know things have been distant. We want to make it up to you. Why don't you come for Christmas? We'll make it work. We really want you here." There it was. The invitation I had so desperately craved just a few weeks ago. the validation. But it felt different now, tainted. It felt like a reaction to his own guilt, a quick fix to assuage his conscience. It wasn't about what I wanted, it was about what he needed to feel like a good son again. And in that moment, I knew I had changed, perhaps irrevocably. My happiness was no longer contingent on an invitation to his house. My sense of self was no longer dependent on his approval. I had my friends. I had my art. I had my foundation. I had a life that was mine, budding and new. "That's very kind of you to offer," I said, and I meant it. The offer was kind, even if the motivation was suspect. "But I'll be staying here for the holidays this year." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear him trying to process this new development. His mother, who had always been available, always willing to drop everything for a chance to be with them, was declining his invitation. "Oh," he said, his voice small. Are you mad at me?" "This isn't about being mad, Thomas," I explained patiently, feeling a strange new surge of strength. "This is about me. I'm making plans here. With my friends. I'm taking a painting class. I'm happy here." He didn't know what to say to that. The idea of me having a life, a happy one, independent of him, was an entirely foreign concept. He had always been the sun, and I, the faithful planet in his orbit. What happens when a planet decides to become its own star? He stammered something about understanding and needing to go. We ended the call politely. After I hung up, I stood by the window, looking out at the bare branches of the oak tree in my yard. I felt no triumph, no sense of victory. Just a quiet, solid sense of peace. I had not rejected my son out of spite. I had simply chosen myself. For the first time, I had looked at two options, one that served his emotional needs and one that served mine, and I had picked mine. It wasn't a grand, dramatic gesture. It was a quiet, internal shift. But it felt like the most important decision I had ever made. The woman who wasn't a priority to her son had finally made herself a priority. And as I looked at my reflection in the window, I saw not a victim, but a survivor. A woman on the cusp of a new beginning, authored entirely by her. My newfound resolve was not a suit of armor that made me impervious to the old pangs of guilt and duty. It was more like a new muscle, one that I had to consciously exercise every day. The first real test came a few weeks before Christmas. Tom called again, his voice tight with a manufactured casualness that I could now see through instantly. "Hey, Mom. Quick question for you," he began, after a few minutes of strained small talk about the weather. "You know how the property taxes are due in January? Well, with the holidays and a few unexpected expenses, things are just a little tight right now. I was wondering if you could possibly, help us out a bit. Just until my bonus comes in February. I'll pay you right back, of course." There it was. The familiar request. In the past, I wouldn't have hesitated. I would have felt a surge of maternal pride at being able to help, at being the reliable family bank. My checkbook would have been open before he even finished the sentence. I would have told myself that this is what a mother does. But this time, his request landed differently. I thought of my budding foundation. I thought of the art supplies I'd bought for Eleanor, who had confessed a secret desire to try oil painting. I thought of the deposit I had just put down for a community center trip to the State Art Museum. My money, for the first time, had a purpose that was entirely my own. It was earmarked for joy, for creativity, for community. It was not a slush fund for my financially comfortable, 42-year-old son who had poor budgeting skills. My heart still did a little flip-flop of anxiety. The word no felt foreign and sharp in my mouth. A lifetime of conditioning screamed at me to say yes, to be accommodating, to be the helper. I took a deep breath, picturing Martha's encouraging smile. "Thomas," I said, my voice much steadier than I felt. "I'm afraid I can't do that." Silence. A thick, shocked silence. I don't think he had ever heard me say no to him about money. "Oh," he finally managed. Is everything okay? Are you having financial trouble?" There was a note of genuine concern in his voice, but it was laced with the inconvenience of his solution being denied. "No, not at all," I replied calmly. "My finances are just fine. But my financial situation has changed. I have my own commitments now. My money is allocated to other things." "Other things?" he asked, a note of incredulity creeping in. "What other things could be more important than helping your family?" The old Rose would have crumbled under the weight of that guilt-laden question. The new Rose recognized it for the manipulation it was. "My commitments are important to me, Thomas," I said, refusing to be drawn into an argument or to justify my choices. My financial decisions were no longer his business. This was the boundary. It was a clean, solid line. "I'm sorry I can't help you this time. I'm sure you and Sarah will figure it out." He was flustered, angry even. "Wow, Mom. Wow. I didn't think you'd be so cold." "It's not about being cold," I said, my voice softening slightly. "I didn't want to be cruel, only clear. It's about being responsible for my own life, just as you are responsible for yours. Saying no isn't a punishment. It's simply a boundary." He mumbled a hasty goodbye and hung up. My hand was trembling as I placed the receiver back in its cradle. My whole body felt jittery with the adrenaline of confrontation. It felt awful. It felt unnatural. But beneath the anxiety, there was a deep, resonant hum of self-respect. I had held my ground. I had protected my newfound purpose. I had treated myself and my goals as if they were valid and important as his. It was a victory, even if it felt like a battle. That evening, I went to my first ever oil painting class at the local art league, something I'd signed up for on a whim. Eleanor came with me, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and excitement. The instructor, a woman in her 40s with paint-streaked hands and a kind smile, showed us how to mix colors on a palette, how to hold the brush, how to see the way light fell on the still life of apples and a pewter pitcher she had set up for us. As I squeezed a vibrant cadmium red onto my palette, the rich, buttery smell of the oil paint filled my senses. It was so different from the delicate transparency of watercolors. It was bold, substantial, forgiving. You could make mistakes. You could scrape the paint off and start again. You could paint over a dark patch with a bright one. I fell in love with it instantly. My first attempt was a mess, a muddy collection of uncertain shapes. But I wasn't discouraged. I was engrossed. For 2 hours, I thought of nothing else. Not Tom. Not my will. Not the difficult phone call. I was completely present, lost in the challenge of trying to capture the curve of an apple, the glint of light on metal. Eleanor, beside me, was equally absorbed, a smudge of viridian green on her cheek. When the class was over, we packed up our supplies, our hands and clothes stained with color. We walked out into the cold night air, our faces flushed with accomplishment. "I was terrible," Eleanor said with a delighted laugh. "But I can't wait to go back next week." "Me too," I said, and the truth of it resonated in my soul. I had said no to my son so that I could say yes to this. Yes to color. Yes to creativity. Yes to friendship. Yes to discovering a part of myself I thought was long dead. Driving home, I realized the boundary I had set with Tom wasn't just about money. It was about energy. It was about reclaiming my own life force. For years, it had been piped directly to him and his family, leaving me depleted. Now, I was capping that pipeline. I was redirecting that precious energy back to its rightful owner. Me. And I was using it to paint my world in bright, bold, beautiful colors. The weeks that followed were a quiet revolution. My life, which had been so monochrome, began to fill with color and texture. The oil painting class became the highlight of my week. I converted the spare bedroom, the one I'd always kept pristine for hypothetical visits, into a small studio. I covered the floor with a drop cloth, set up an easel by the window where the light was best, and filled the space with the glorious, messy clutter of creation. The smell of linseed oil and turpentine replaced the faint, sad scent of potpourri. My paintings were clumsy at first, the work of a beginner. But they were mine. I painted the view from my window, the vase of sunflowers Martha brought me, Arthur's face from memory, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. Each canvas was a conversation with myself, a testament to my own existence. My social life, once confined to polite nods at the grocery store, blossomed. The coffee and conversation group became the hub of my week. We started a book club, our first selection being a fiercely debated historical novel Arthur recommended. George, despite his grumbling, turned out to have surprisingly sharp literary insights. We planned outings. The museum trip was a resounding success. I stood before a vast, abstract canvas by Mark Rothko, a sea of deep reds and maroons, and felt tears well in my eyes. It wasn't sadness, it was a profound sense of connection, of feeling something so deeply it had no words. I looked over and saw Eleanor staring at a delicate Degas sculpture of a dancer, her face wrapped with a similar emotion. We were not just passing time until our days ran out, we were actively engaging with the beauty and complexity of the world. I even took a small trip, something I'd never done alone. It wasn't the grand tour of Italy I'd once dreamed of, but a 3-day bus trip to a nearby coastal town famous for its historic lighthouse and charming bed and breakfasts. I was nervous at first, but the feeling quickly gave way to a thrilling sense of freedom. I ate what I wanted, when I wanted. I spent an entire afternoon sitting on a bench watching the waves crash against the shore, with no one to please but myself. I wandered through little shops, buying a beautiful hand-knitted shawl for myself without once thinking, "Oh, this is too expensive." I was investing in my own comfort, my own joy. I returned home not exhausted, but energized, with a newfound confidence in my own capability. One crisp December afternoon, just a week before Christmas, I was in my studio, working on a painting of that very lighthouse, trying to capture the pearly gray of the winter sky. The doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. Wiping my hands on a rag, I went to the door and peered through the peephole. My heart skipped a beat. It was Tom. He stood on my porch, looking uncertain and smaller than I remembered. He wasn't wearing a suit, just jeans and a winter jacket. He held a small, brightly wrapped gift in his hands. My first instinct was a jolt of the old anxiety, the immediate urge to manage his emotions, to make things comfortable. But I took a breath and centered myself before opening the door. "Thomas," I said, my voice neutral. "This is a surprise." "Hi, Mom," he said, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Can I come in for a minute?" I hesitated for only a second before stepping back to let him pass. He walked into the entryway and stopped, looking around as if seeing the place for the first time. His eyes landed on the open door to my new studio, at the easel and the chaotic, colorful mess within. "What's all this?" he asked, a look of genuine confusion on his face. "That's my studio," I said simply. "I've taken up painting again." He walked to the doorway and peered inside, his gaze falling on the nearly finished painting of the lighthouse. You painted that? It's really good, Mom." "Thank you," I said, refusing to let the compliment undo me. "I'm enjoying it." He turned back to face me, his own face a complicated mask of emotions. He seemed to be struggling for words. "Mom, I've been doing a lot of thinking," he began, his voice low. "Since our phone calls. Since you said no to me." He looked down at the floor, then back up at me, and his eyes were glistening. "You were right. I've been a terrible son. I took you for granted. I treated you like an ATM and a free babysitting service and an obligation. Not like my mother." He took a shaky breath. "Things with Sarah. They came to a head. We're in counseling now. I'm starting to see how much I've put on her, how much I've expected from everyone. How I've just been bulldozing through my life thinking only about what I want." He held out a small gift. This isn't meant to fix anything. I know that. It's just, I wanted to give you something. For Christmas." I took the small box. My hands were steady. I didn't open it. I just looked at my son, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in years. I saw not the villain of my story, nor the center of my universe. I saw a flawed, struggling man who was, perhaps, just beginning to wake up. I saw a hint of the little boy I had loved so fiercely, but I also saw the stranger he had become. The question was, who could he be in the future? My heart ached with a complex mix of old love and new wisdom. Forgiveness was a simple word for a very complicated process. Letting him back into my life couldn't mean returning to the old ways. It couldn't mean sacrificing the new, vibrant world I was building for myself. He had broken something, and while it had forced me to build something stronger in its place, the scar tissue was still tender. "Thank you, Thomas," I said, my voice quiet. "Would you like a cup of coffee?" It was a simple question, but it felt momentous. It was an offer not of absolution, but of civility. A chance for a new kind of conversation to begin, one between two adults, on new, more equal footing. He nodded, a look of profound relief washing over his face as I turned to walk toward the kitchen, the same kitchen where my world had fallen apart just a few months before. I felt a strange sense of coming full circle. The stage was the same, but the actors had changed. He was a man humbled by his own failings, and I was a woman empowered by hers. I had no idea where this scene would lead, but for the first time, I felt confident that I was the one directing it. I put on a fresh pot of coffee, the familiar aroma filling the kitchen. This time, however, it wasn't the scent of a routine steeped in duty, but of a conscious choice. Tom sat at the kitchen table, in the same chair he had occupied on that fateful morning, but he seemed smaller in it now, less imposing. He looked around the room, at the familiar worn countertops and the magnets on the refrigerator, as if seeing them through a new prescription. I placed 2 mugs on the table, along with the cream and sugar, and sat down opposite him. The silence between us wasn't as heavy as before, but it was thick with unspoken questions. I decided I would not be the one to fill it. This was his visit, his initiative. I would wait. Finally, he spoke. "The house feels different," he said quietly. "It feels more like you." I knew what he meant. For years, the house had been a perfectly preserved museum of my life with Frank, and then a quiet waiting room for my role as a grandmother. Now, it was alive with my own energy. There was a stack of library books on the counter, a half-finished scarf Eleanor was teaching me to knit lay on a chair, and through the doorway, the vibrant mess of my studio was clearly visible. It was the home of a person with an active, engaged life. "I'm different," I replied simply. He nodded, stirring his coffee. "I can see that. Mom. I'm not here to ask for anything. Not forgiveness, not money, not for you to come for the holidays. Sarah and I are going to have a quiet Christmas this year, just the 4 of us. We need to work on us." He looked me in the eye, and the sincerity there was something I hadn't seen in a long time. "I'm here because I realized something when you said you were happy, that you had your own life." My first reaction was anger. And then I realized it was because I was scared. I'd built my whole world on the idea that you would always be there, in the background, as my safety net. I never stopped to think about whether that safety net was happy. His words were a balm on a wound I hadn't realized was still so raw. It was the acknowledgement I had craved, not of my sacrifices, but of my personhood. "My life with your father, and raising you. It had its own joys, Thomas," I said carefully. "I don't regret the love I gave. But I do regret the parts of myself I lost along the way. I'm finding them again now." "The painting?" he asked, gesturing toward the studio. "The painting," I confirmed with a small smile. "And the friendships. And learning to be on my own. It's a whole new world at 76." We sat for a while longer, talking more than we had in years. Not about his problems or my loneliness, but about books, about art, about the funny thing George had said at the coffee group. It was a tentative, fragile conversation, like the first shoots of grass after a long winter. It was a new beginning. Before he left, I finally opened his gift. Inside the small box was a beautiful, handcrafted leather-bound journal and a set of fine-quality sketching pencils. Tucked inside the journal was a note, written in his familiar scrawl: "For your stories and your pictures, Mom. I'm so sorry it took me so long to see them. love, Tom. Tears pricked my eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of a complex, bittersweet release. It wasn't a magic wand that fixed everything. The years of neglect couldn't be erased by one apology and a thoughtful gift. But it was a start. It was a recognition. It was a bridge, however narrow, back to each other. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice thick. "This is a lovely gift." He gave me a hesitant, hopeful smile. "Merry Christmas, Mom." "Merry Christmas, Thomas." After he left, I didn't feel the old, familiar ache of his absence. The house did not feel empty. It felt full. Full of my life, my art, my plans. His visit was not the main event of my day, it was simply a part of it. Later that evening, I was meeting Martha and Arthur for a simple holiday dinner at a local restaurant. The following week, my foundation would officially be registered with the state. On my easel, the lighthouse painting was waiting for its final touches of bright, hopeful light on the horizon. My relationship with Tom would be a work in progress. It would require new boundaries, new expectations, and a level of honesty we'd never had before. Maybe he would continue his journey of self-awareness, and maybe he wouldn't. Maybe our relationship would blossom into something new and healthy, or maybe it would remain a more distant, polite connection. But for the first time, my own happiness didn't depend on the outcome. I had spent a lifetime pouring my love into others, hoping it would make me whole. But Tom's cruel words had inadvertently set me on a different path. They had forced me to turn inward, to find the source of that love within myself. It was there all along, buried under decades of duty and expectation. It was in my hands when I held a paintbrush, in my laughter with my friends, in the quiet confidence of making a choice that was purely my own. That evening, as I got ready to go out, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I saw the same 76-year-old woman, with her white hair and wrinkled skin. But her eyes were different. They were bright. They were clear. They were full of a light that came from within. The sun was setting outside, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and pink and purple. A masterpiece. I smiled at the woman in the mirror. She was free. She was no longer just a mother, a widow, a grandmother. She was Rose. And her life, in all its beautiful, messy, vibrant color, was just beginning.